The foggy harbor lights cast eerie reflections on the water when Sarah Lynn Collins disappeared from Baltimore's inner harbor on a cold February night in 1986. At 11:20 p.m., a security guard at the National Aquarium noticed a petite brunette in a red peacoat standing beside a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass. The young woman, a 22-year-old Johns Hopkins nursing student, clutched her leather shoulder bag as she spoke with someone inside the idling car. By morning, her dormitory bed remained untouched, and the only trace of Sarah was her student ID card found near the water's edge. What happened in those missing hours would haunt Baltimore for decades to come, eventually revealing a killer who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Baltimore, Maryland, February 12, 1986. The city was experiencing one of the coldest winters on record, with temperatures plunging below freezing for weeks. Patches of ice coated the inner harbor, and the famous brick promenades stood nearly empty in the bitter cold. The usual bustle of Baltimore's crown jewel tourist area had given way to an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional foghorn from cargo ships entering the harbor. At Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing, the evening had been ordinary. Students huddled in the library, preparing for midterm exams. Among them was Sarah Lynn Collins, a second-year nursing student known for her bright smile and dedication to her studies. She had grown up in a small town in Delaware, the daughter of a factory worker and a kindergarten teacher, and had earned a partial scholarship to pursue her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse. At 10:15 p.m., security cameras captured Sarah leaving the library, waving goodbye to classmates. She wore a distinctive red peacoat that stood out against the darkness, her chestnut hair tucked under a knitted beanie. Friends would later recall she mentioned heading straight back to her dormitory, a 15-minute walk across campus. But something changed her plans. Instead of taking her usual route, Sarah made an unexpected detour. She caught the number 7 bus downtown, arriving at the inner harbor just before 11 p.m. The harbor, normally crowded with tourists and locals alike, was nearly deserted due to the bone-chilling cold. Only a handful of restaurants remained open, their windows glowing warmly against the night. At precisely 11:20 p.m., Howard Jenkins, a security guard at the National Aquarium, was making his final rounds before the end of his shift. Through the foggy mist, he spotted a young woman in a red coat standing near the water's edge, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone inside a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass. Jenkins noted the car's engine was running, exhaust vapors billowing in the cold air. She seemed tense, Jenkins would later tell police. Arms folded tight, shaking her head like she was saying no to something. I almost walked over to check if everything was okay, but my supervisor called on the radio about locking up. When I looked back a few minutes later, both she and the car were gone. That momentary glimpse would be the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Lynn Collins. At 8:15 a.m. the following morning, Sarah's roommate, Melissa Parker, called campus security. Sarah's bed hadn't been slept in, her textbook sat untouched on her desk, and her insulin medication for type 1 diabetes remained in the small refrigerator they shared. For a studious, responsible student like Sarah, this was completely out of character. "Sarah never stayed out without telling me," Melissa insisted to the campus security officer who took her report. "And she would never ever miss her insulin dose." "Something's wrong. I know it." By 9:30 a.m., the Baltimore Police Department had been notified, but initial responses were tepid at best. Missing college students were not uncommon, especially after nights out. Most returned within 24 hours, sheepish and apologetic. But Detective Marcus Reeves, a 15-year veteran of the force, sensed this case was different. The abandoned insulin medication raised immediate red flags. "If she's diabetic and left her medication behind, we need to treat this as urgent," Reeves told his supervisor, requesting permission to begin an immediate investigation rather than waiting the standard 48 hours for missing adults. By noon, Officers were interviewing Sarah's classmates, professors, and dormitory neighbors. The first concrete lead came at 2:15 p.m., when a maintenance worker found Sarah's student ID card near the water's edge at the inner harbor, not far from where Howard Jenkins had spotted her the night before. A light dusting of snow had fallen overnight, but the card lay on top of it, suggesting it had been dropped or discarded that morning. Detective Reeves immediately dispatched officers to the harbor. They cordoned off the area and began an intensive search. Security camera footage from nearby businesses was collected, though many of the cameras in 1986 were rudimentary at best, offering grainy, indistinct images that provided little usable information. By evening, Sarah's disappearance had made the local news. Her parents, Thomas and Elaine Collins, arrived from Delaware, their faces etched with worry as they made a tearful plea on the evening broadcast. "Sarah is our only child," Elaine sobbed, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter's graduation. "She's responsible, loving, and would never just vanish without telling anyone. She needs her medication. If anyone has seen her, please call the police." Thomas Collins, a stoic man unaccustomed to public displays of emotion, added, "To whoever might have our daughter, she has a medical condition. Without her insulin, she could die. Please just let her come home to us." The following morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day, a dedicated task force was established. Detective Reeves led the investigation, working alongside his partner, Detective Anna Martinez, one of the few female detectives in the department at that time. They set up a command center at the Central District Police Station, walls quickly filling with maps, timelines, and photographs. The search expanded beyond the inner harbor to include surrounding neighborhoods. Volunteers from Johns Hopkins joined the effort, distributing flyers with Sarah's photo across the city. The image of the pretty nursing student with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile became familiar to Baltimore residents within days. Howard Jenkins's sighting of the blue Oldsmobile became a central focus of the investigation. Detectives combed through vehicle registrations, identifying 347 blue Oldsmobile Cutlasses in the greater Baltimore area. Each owner had to be interviewed, their whereabouts on the night of February 12th verified. Meanwhile, forensic teams carefully examined the area where Sarah's ID card was found. Despite the cold weather, which had preserved the scene, they discovered little physical evidence. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate what might have happened after she was seen speaking with someone in the blue car. Sarah's dormitory room was equally puzzling. Everything appeared normal. Books stacked neatly on her desk, clothes hanging in her closet, a bed made with hospital corners, a skill she'd learned in her clinical rotations. Her wallet, containing $43 and her driver's license, sat on her nightstand. Her passport remained in the desk drawer. Only her shoulder bag and the clothes she was wearing were missing. "It doesn't look like she was planning to go anywhere," Detective Martinez noted, scanning the room. "This isn't someone who packed and left. This is someone who stepped out, expecting to come back." As the investigation entered its third day, the medical urgency became critical. Without insulin, Sarah would have been in severe diabetic ketoacidosis by now. Hospital emergency rooms were alerted to watch for young women matching her description, who might be brought in unconscious. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A parking attendant at a garage near the harbor came forward after seeing Sarah's photo on the news. He recalled issuing a ticket to a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass at 11:40 p.m. on February 12th, noting it because the driver had been agitated, revving the engine impatiently while waiting for his ticket. "I remember looking in the passenger seat and seeing a red coat," the attendant told detectives. "Didn't see a face, though. Just the coat, like it was laid flat on the seat. No one sitting in it." The parking ticket provided a critical piece of information, a partial license plate number. Combined with the vehicle registration database, it narrowed the search to just 17 cars. Officers worked around the clock, tracking down each owner. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On February 18th, 6 days after Sarah's disappearance, officers located the 16th car on their list. The blue Oldsmobile Cutlass belonged to Michael Whitfield, a 32-year-old radiology technician at Mercy Medical Center. The vehicle was parked in the hospital staff lot, appearing freshly washed despite the winter weather that had left most cars coated in salt and grime. Detective Reeves approached Whitfield at the hospital. The technician was polite but visibly nervous when questioned about his whereabouts on February 12th. He claimed he'd been working a late shift, then went straight home to the apartment he shared with his girlfriend in Fells Point. "Check with the hospital," he suggested, running a hand through his thinning brown hair. "They'll confirm my shift." Hospital records did show Whitfield had been scheduled to work until 10 p.m. that night, and several colleagues confirmed seeing him. However, there was a critical gap. No one could verify his presence between 10:30 p.m. and the following morning. When asked about visiting the Inner Harbor after his shift, Whitfield became defensive. "Why would I go down there in that weather? It was freezing. I went home, had a beer, watched some TV, and went to bed." His girlfriend, Lisa Pearson, initially corroborated his story, but seemed uncertain about the timing. When interviewed separately, she admitted, "I was asleep when he got home. I heard him come in, but I couldn't tell you exactly what time it was." The detectives obtained a warrant to search Whitfield's car. Initial visual inspection revealed nothing suspicious. The vehicle was immaculately clean. However, when forensic technicians used luminol, a substance that detects traces of blood even after cleaning, the passenger seat lit up with an eerie blue glow. "Someone bled in that car," the technician confirmed, "and someone tried very hard to clean it up." Further examination revealed microscopic traces of fabric caught in the door hinge, a small piece of red wool matching the description of Sarah's coat. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough for detectives to place Whitfield under 24-hour surveillance while they built their case. The investigation took a dramatic turn on February 22nd, when a fisherman made a grim discovery. Near the Francis Scott Key Bridge, about 5 miles from the Inner Harbor, a woman's body had washed ashore. The red peacoat, though waterlogged and mud-stained, was immediately recognizable. Sarah Lynn Collins had been found. The autopsy confirmed what many had feared. Sarah had been strangled. The medical examiner noted ligature marks consistent with a thin cord or wire. Defensive wounds on her hands indicated she had fought desperately for her life. Time of death was estimated to be within hours of her disappearance. Most troubling was the finding that she had indeed suffered diabetic shock before her death, likely making her weak and disoriented, easier to overpower. Traces of insulin were found in her system, but not enough to manage her condition properly. The discovery of Sarah's body transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Baltimore, already struggling with rising crime rates in the mid-1980s, was stunned by the murder of a promising young nursing student with no apparent connection to the city's drug or gang problems. Mayor William Donald Schaefer addressed the city on television, promising that every resource would be dedicated to finding Sarah's killer. Johns Hopkins University established a scholarship in her name. The Inner Harbor, intended to be the jewel of Baltimore's urban renewal, suddenly seemed tainted by darkness. For detectives Reeves and Martinez, the physical evidence was mounting, but still circumstantial. They needed something definitive to connect Michael Whitfield to the murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A nurse at Mercy Medical Center approached the police after watching the news coverage. She reported that Whitfield had shown an unusual interest in Sarah when the nursing student had rotated through the radiology department the previous semester. He would always volunteer to demonstrate procedures when she was there, the nurse recalled. He asked questions about her schedule, where she lived on campus. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly, but looking back, it seemed excessive. Further investigation revealed that Whitfield had accessed the hospital directory multiple times to look up information about student nurses. He had even been reprimanded once for making unwanted advances toward another student. When detectives searched Whitfield's apartment, they discovered a hidden collection of newspaper clippings about Sarah's disappearance, neatly arranged in a folder. Even more damning, tucked inside his nightstand, was a silver charm bracelet identified by Sarah's roommate as a gift from Sarah's parents for her 21st birthday. On February 27, 1986, 15 days after Sarah Lynn Collins disappeared, Michael Whitfield was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Baltimore. Hospital colleagues expressed disbelief that the quiet, seemingly ordinary technician could be capable of such a crime. But as the investigation deepened, a disturbing portrait emerged of a man obsessed with the young nursing student, one who had carefully planned and executed her abduction when she rejected his advances. Surveillance footage from campus, previously overlooked, now showed Whitfield's blue Oldsmobile passing by the nursing school multiple times in the weeks before Sarah's disappearance. Phone records revealed he had called her dormitory repeatedly, hanging up when anyone other than Sarah answered. The case against Whitfield strengthened when forensic analysis of the ligature marks on Sarah's neck matched a distinctive pattern to a wire coat hanger found in his apartment's storage closet. The same type of wire contained traces of skin and blood that, even with the limited DNA technology of the time, were consistent with Sarah's blood type. For Thomas and Elaine Collins, the arrest brought little comfort. Their only daughter was gone. Her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse ended by a man she barely knew. At a press conference, Thomas spoke briefly, his voice breaking. "We raised our daughter to be kind, to help others. She would have saved lives as a nurse. Instead, hers was taken by someone who should have been saving lives himself. There's no sense to be made of that kind of evil." As winter turned to spring, Baltimore struggled to reconcile the horror of Sarah's murder with the city's ongoing efforts at revitalization. The Inner Harbor development had been meant to signal Baltimore's transformation from a declining industrial port to a modern tourist destination. Now it would forever be associated with the death of a young woman who had trusted the wrong person on a cold February night. The case file for Sarah Lynn Collins grew thick with evidence, witness statements and forensic reports. Detective Reeves, known for his emotional detachment, found himself deeply affected by the case. "Sometimes a victim gets under your skin," he confessed to his partner. "Sarah was going to do something good with her life. She deserved better than this. They all do, but her case is going to stay with me." As Michael Whitfield awaited trial in the Baltimore City Detention Center, the city held a candlelight vigil at the Inner Harbor. Thousands attended, including Sarah's classmates, professors, and patients she had cared for during her clinical rotations. The harbor waters reflected countless flames, a testament to a life cut tragically short and a community forever changed by loss. For Baltimore, once proudly known as Charm City, the mask of urban renewal had slipped, revealing the darker currents that ran beneath its surface. The case of Sarah Lynn Collins would go down in history as one of the city's most haunting crimes, a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding in plain sight, wearing a uniform of respectability, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The years passed slowly for the Collins family. Baltimore's seasons changed. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the harbor in spring. Tourists flocked to the waterfront during humid summers. Leaves turned golden in fall. And winter brought back the haunting anniversary of their daughter's murder. For most of Baltimore, life moved forward. The Inner Harbor continued its transformation into a polished tourist attraction. New restaurants, hotels, and attractions sprang up where once there had been only decaying warehouses. But for Detective Marcus Reeves, time seemed frozen in February 1986. The case of Sarah Lynn Collins haunted him through promotions and transfers. He kept a small photo of Sarah tucked in his wallet, a reminder of justice only half served. Michael Whitfield's trial had been swift by Baltimore standards. The evidence against him, the blood traces in his car, the wire coat hanger matching Sarah's neck wounds, her charm bracelet found in his apartment, painted a damning picture. Prosecutors described how the hospital technician had developed an unhealthy fixation on the young nursing student, stalking her for months before finally approaching her at the inner harbor that cold February night. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Whitfield to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, the maximum penalty allowed under Maryland law at that time. Whitfield maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he'd found the charm bracelet at the hospital and kept it to return to Sarah. He insisted the blood in his car came from transporting an injured colleague weeks earlier. The jury didn't believe him, but Reeves sensed something wasn't right. "He's guilty as sin," Reeves told his partner after the verdict. "But something's missing. The pieces fit too neatly, like they've been forced together." By 1996, a decade after Sarah's murder, Reeves had been promoted to lieutenant in charge of Baltimore's cold case unit. The promotion came with a corner office decorated with commendations and a window overlooking the city he'd served for 25 years. On quiet afternoons, he would pull out the Collins file, rereading witness statements, re-examining crime scene photos, searching for the something that still nagged at the edges of his consciousness. The case should have been closed. The killer was behind bars. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been served. But for Reeves, questions lingered. Why had Sarah gone to the inner harbor that night? If she'd been meeting Whitfield, why would she willingly approach a man she reportedly found threatening? And if she hadn't gone to meet him, what had drawn her there? These questions remained unanswered, filed away as one of those loose ends that sometimes couldn't be tied up in homicide investigations. Until November 2018, when everything changed. Baltimore Police Department's forensic laboratory had begun the painstaking process of reviewing evidence from pre-DNA testing cases. New technology allowed for testing of samples previously too small or too degraded for analysis. The cold case unit submitted hundreds of samples from unsolved murders dating back decades. Lieutenant Reeves, now 3 months from retirement, hadn't initially included the Collins case. Whitfield was still in prison, his appeals exhausted. The case was technically solved, but something, perhaps intuition, perhaps that nagging doubt that had never fully subsided, led Reeves to add the evidence from Sarah's murder to the testing queue. "Just to be thorough," he told the lab technician as he handed over the sealed evidence bags containing Sarah's clothing and the wire hanger used to strangle her. On December 14, 2018, the results came back. Reeves was sitting at his desk, sorting through files to be transferred to his replacement when the report arrived. At first, the findings seemed to confirm what they already knew. Whitfield's DNA was present on the charm bracelet found in his apartment. But then came the anomaly. The wire coat hanger, the murder weapon that had left the distinctive pattern on Sarah's neck, contained DNA from 2 individuals, an unknown male and Sarah herself. Michael Whitfield's DNA was not present. Reeves read the report 3 times, his heart pounding. For 32 years, they had built the case on the fact that the wire coat hanger found in Whitfield's apartment was the murder weapon. Now DNA evidence suggested someone else had handled the actual murder weapon. "Get me everything we have on Whitfield's conviction," Reeves barked to his assistant. "And I need to see the original evidence. All of it." Within hours, Reeves' office was transformed into a war room. Evidence boxes stacked against the walls, crime scene photos taped to his windows, blocking the view of Baltimore's skyline. He called Detective Anna Martinez, his former partner who had worked the original case with him, now retired and living in Florida. "Anna, it's Marcus. I need you to think back to the Whitfield arrest. The wire hanger we found in his apartment, did you see it recovered yourself?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No," Martinez finally said. "It was logged in by Officer Peters, I think. Why?" "Because someone's DNA is on the actual murder weapon, and it's not Whitfield's." The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. A review team was assembled, consisting of Reeves, the current head of homicide, 2 prosecutors from the district attorney's office, and a representative from the Innocence Project, which had taken an interest in the case. They began by re-examining every piece of evidence and every procedural step taken during the original investigation. What they found was disturbing. The wire coat hanger recovered from Whitfield's apartment and the wire used to strangle Sarah were similar but not identical. The evidence log showed they had been collected and catalogued by the same officer, Lawrence Peters. Officer Peters had been a rookie in 1986, eager to prove himself. He had been first on the scene when Sarah's body was discovered and had also participated in the search of Whitfield's apartment. His name appeared frequently throughout the case file. "Where is Peters now?" Reeves asked during a team meeting. "Retired," the homicide chief responded. "Left the force in 2002, bought a fishing cabin in western Maryland. Keeps to himself mostly." Reeves frowned. "I want to talk to him." The drive to Cumberland, Maryland took just over 2 hours. The January landscape was barren, skeletal trees reaching toward a steel-gray sky. Reeves drove in silence, his mind sifting through decades-old memories, looking for something he might have missed. Peter's cabin sat on a small rise overlooking Deep Creek Lake, smoke curling from the chimney. A blue Ford pickup was parked in the gravel driveway. Reeves pulled up behind it, noticing a familiar bumper sticker, the Baltimore Police Department shield with the words, "Serving with Pride," beneath it. The former officer answered the door dressed in flannel and denim, his once dark hair now silver, his face weathered by sun and wind. Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Lieutenant Reeves," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Been a long time." "Too long, Larry," Reeves replied. "Mind if I come in? Need to ask you about an old case." Peters hesitated, then stepped back, allowing Reeves into the cabin. The interior was spartanly furnished, a worn leather couch, a wooden dining table, fishing gear stacked in one corner. Photos lined the mantel above a crackling fireplace. Reeves noticed one showing a much younger Peters in uniform, standing beside a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass. "Nice car," Reeves commented, nodding toward the photo. "That yours?" Peters' expression tightened. "Used to be. Sold it years ago. What case are you here about?" "Sarah Collins, 1986. I think you remember it." The former officer's face remained impassive, but Reeves noticed his hands, steady hands that had once handled evidence at countless crime scenes, trembling slightly. "That case is closed," Peter said flatly. "Whitfield's been in prison for 30 years. "That's the problem," Reeves replied, maintaining eye contact. "We just ran DNA tests on the wire used to strangle Sarah. Whitfield's DNA isn't on it, but someone else's is." The color drained from Peter's face. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "You can't prove anything," he whispered, more to himself than to Reeves. But they could, and they did. Back in Baltimore, the investigation team obtained a warrant for Peters' DNA. The results confirmed what Reeves had suspected since seeing the photo on the mantel. The unknown DNA on the murder weapon belonged to former Officer Lawrence Peters. The revelation turned the Baltimore Police Department upside down. One of their own had not only committed murder, but had framed an innocent man and participated in the investigation that sent him to prison. Internal Affairs launched a comprehensive review of every case Peters had worked on during his 16 years with the force. For Reeves, the betrayal cut deep. He had worked alongside Peters, trusted his evidence collection, built a case on his testimony. Now, 3 decades later, he faced the horrifying realization that he had helped send an innocent man to prison while the real killer continued to wear a badge. The why of it all emerged slowly, through painstaking reinvestigation and eventually Peters' own confession. In 1985, Peters had been a patrol officer assigned to the area, including Johns Hopkins University. He had encountered Sarah Collins while responding to a minor incident at her dormitory, a false fire alarm. He had been struck by her beauty and had begun finding excuses to patrol near the nursing school, hoping to see her again. When he finally approached her after weeks of watching from afar, Sarah had firmly rejected his advances. The rejection had festered in Peter's mind, his infatuation turning to obsession. On February 12, 1986, Peters had been off duty, driving his personal vehicle, a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass. He spotted Sarah at a campus bus stop and followed her to the inner harbor. There, he approached her again, offering her a ride back to campus due to the cold. When she recognized him and declined, something in him snapped. The confession, recorded in a sterile interrogation room at Baltimore Police Headquarters, was clinical in its horror. Peters described how he had forced Sarah into his car, driven to a secluded area near the Key Bridge, and strangled her with a wire coat hanger in a moment of rage when she threatened to report him. He had then disposed of her body in the harbor, expecting tides to carry it out to sea. When it was discovered days later, he had volunteered to assist with the investigation to monitor progress. As evidence mounted against Michael Whitfield, Peters had seen an opportunity. He planted the charm bracelet in Whitfield's apartment during the execution of the search warrant. He substituted a similar wire coat hanger for the actual murder weapon, ensuring it contained trace evidence that could be linked to Sarah. As a respected officer, his evidence handling had gone unquestioned. On March 7, 2019, 33 years after Sarah Collins' murder, Lawrence Peters was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. The news exploded across Baltimore and beyond, making national headlines. "Badge of dishonor," proclaimed the Baltimore Sun. "Former cop charged in 1986 murder." Innocent man served 33 years. For Thomas Collins, now 79 and a widower, Elaine having passed away in 2012, still believing her daughter's killer was behind bars, the revelation was both devastating and vindicating. "I always felt something wasn't right," he told reporters, his voice quavering with age and emotion. "The man they arrested didn't seem to fit what happened to my Sarah. Now I know why." Michael Whitfield, 65, was released from the Maryland Correctional Institution after serving 33 years for a crime he didn't commit. Emerging from the prison gates, thin and grey but standing tall, he was met by a team from the Innocence Project and a contingent of reporters. "I always said I was innocent," Whitfield stated, blinking in the bright spring sunshine. "I always said it, but no one would listen. Now I just want what's left of my life back." The state of Maryland would later approve a settlement of $5, $3 million in compensation for Whitfield's wrongful conviction, approximately $160,000 for each year of freedom lost. No amount, of course, could truly compensate for 3 decades behind bars. For Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, the case brought a complex mix of emotions. Pride in finally uncovering the truth, devastating guilt for his role in Whitfield's wrongful conviction, and a grim satisfaction in knowing that Peters would now face justice. He postponed his retirement indefinitely, determined to see the case through to its conclusion. The trial of Lawrence Peters began in September 2019. The courtroom was packed daily, with journalists, law enforcement officials, and members of the public captivated by the shocking turn of events. The prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by Peters' own confession and the damning DNA evidence. Peters' defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to his obsessive fixation on Sarah. But psychiatric evaluations found him fully competent, both at the time of the murder and during the subsequent cover-up. The calculated nature of his actions, following Sarah, disposing of evidence, framing Whitfield, spoke to a clear, deliberate mind. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, expressing particular revulsion at the abuse of police authority, sentenced Peters to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence harsher than the one Whitfield had served for a crime he didn't commit. As Peters was led away in handcuffs, Reeves watched from the gallery, his face impassive. Decades of police work had taught him to hide his emotions, but inside, a storm raged. How many signs had he missed? How many inconsistencies had he overlooked because he trusted a fellow officer? The case prompted significant reforms within the Baltimore Police Department. Evidence handling procedures were overhauled, with stricter chain of custody requirements and mandatory video recording of searches. Cold cases involving officers as witnesses or evidence handlers were prioritized for review. An independent oversight committee was established to examine potential misconduct. For the city of Baltimore, the case became a symbol of both failure and redemption. Failure of a system that had allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned while a killer wore a badge, and redemption in the eventual pursuit of true justice, however delayed. In December 2019, a memorial garden was dedicated to Sarah Collins on the Johns Hopkins campus. A small bronze statue depicted a young woman in a nursing uniform, her hands outstretched in a gesture of healing. The plaque read, "In memory of Sarah Lynn Collins, 1964-1986, whose life was dedicated to caring for others, and whose death reminds us that justice may be delayed but must never be abandoned." At the dedication ceremony, Michael Whitfield and Thomas Collins stood side by side, two men whose lives had been shattered by the same act of violence, now finding an unexpected bond in their shared loss and long-delayed vindication. "I never got to know your daughter," Whitfield said quietly to the elderly man beside him, "but I thought about her every day for 33 years. In a strange way, we were both victims of the same crime." Thomas Collins nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She would have liked you, I think. Sarah could always see the good in people." As dusk fell over the garden, Lieutenant Marcus Reeves lingered after most of the crowd had dispersed. He approached the statue, studying the serene face of the young woman whose case had bookended his career. "We got it right this time, Sarah," he whispered, placing a single white rose at the base of the memorial. "Finally got it right." The story of Sarah Collins and Michael Whitfield became required study in criminal justice programs across the country, a stark reminder of how easily justice can be perverted when those entrusted with upholding the law become its worst violators. For Baltimore, once proudly known as Charm City, the case forced a painful reckoning. The gleaming towers of the revitalized inner harbor might reflect brightly in the water, but beneath the surface, currents of corruption, prejudice, and abuse of power had long flowed unchecked. As Peters began serving his life sentence in the same prison where Whitfield had spent 33 years, a new generation of Baltimore police officers was being trained with the Collins case as a cautionary tale. Evidence rooms now displayed photos of both Sarah Collins and Michael Whitfield, silent reminders that the pursuit of justice required more than simply closing cases. It demanded truth, regardless of where that truth might lead. The blue Oldsmobile Cutlass that had featured so prominently in the case was eventually located in a junkyard in Pennsylvania. The Baltimore Police Department purchased the rusted shell and had it destroyed, a symbolic attempt to close a dark chapter in the department's history. But for those most intimately affected by the case, closure would never truly come. Thomas Collins visited his daughter's grave weekly, now telling her about the real killer being brought to justice. Michael Whitfield struggled to rebuild a life after 3 decades of imprisonment, finding the world changed almost beyond recognition. And Marcus Reeves, who had devoted his career to seeking justice for victims, now grappled with his unwitting role in perpetuating an injustice. On the anniversary of Sarah's death in February 2020, a small group gathered at the Inner Harbor. Thomas Collins, Michael Whitfield, and Marcus Reeves, along with a handful of Sarah's former classmates, now in their 50s. They released white roses into the water, watching as the current carried them toward the Chesapeake Bay and eventually the open sea. 34 years, Thomas Collins murmured, his breath fogging in the winter air. It took 34 years to learn the truth. Some never get even that, Whitfield replied gently. At least now we know. Reeves remained silent, watching the flowers drift away. In his pocket, he still carried the photo of Sarah that had accompanied him through decades of police work. He had considered returning it to Thomas Collins, but couldn't bring himself to part with it. The image reminded him of both his greatest failure and his final redemption, a career-long journey toward a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. As the group dispersed, Reeves lingered, gazing out over the water where Sarah's body had been found so many years ago. Baltimore's skyline glittered behind him, a city transformed since 1986, yet still grappling with many of the same demons. "Charm City," he murmured to himself. The nickname had always seemed ironic to those who worked in law enforcement, aware of the city's darker realities beneath its tourist-friendly veneer. Now, with the exposure of Peter's crimes and the systemic failures that had allowed them to go undetected for so long, that irony cut deeper than ever. Yet even as he acknowledged the darkness, Reeves found himself holding on to hope. The system had failed catastrophically, but it had also eventually corrected itself. The truth had emerged, however belatedly. Justice, imperfect and painfully delayed, had finally been served. For Baltimore, for the Collins family, for Michael Whitfield, and for Reeves himself. That hard-won truth represented both an ending and a beginning, a chance to acknowledge past failures and commit to a more vigilant future where badges could not be used as shields for evil, where evidence would be scrutinized regardless of its source, and where the pursuit of justice would not end until the actual truth was uncovered. The Lawrence Peters trial sent shockwaves through law enforcement across Maryland and beyond. Police departments nationwide began reviewing their evidence handling procedures, implementing new oversight measures, and re-evaluating cold cases. For many, the shocking revelation that an officer had committed murder and framed an innocent man represented their worst fears about corruption within their ranks. For the citizens of Baltimore, the case reopened old wounds while simultaneously validating long-held suspicions about police misconduct. In a city with a complex history of tension between law enforcement and communities, particularly communities of color, the Peters case became a focal point for discussions about reform, accountability, and justice. The Maryland Innocence Project, which had helped secure Michael Whitfield's release, saw a surge in case submissions. Within months, they had identified 5 other convictions potentially tainted by Peters' involvement. Each required meticulous review, reopening painful chapters for victims' families who had believed justice had been served decades earlier. By summer 2020, Michael Whitfield had settled into a modest apartment in Towson, just north of Baltimore. The state's financial compensation had provided security, but no amount of money could restore the decades lost. At 66, he found himself learning to use smartphones, the internet, and other technologies that had transformed the world during his incarceration. Simple tasks like using an ATM or self-checkout at grocery stores became overwhelming challenges. "Everything is screens now," he remarked to a reporter who interviewed him 6 months after his release. "When I went in, we had rotary phones and 3 TV channels. Sometimes I feel like I've landed on another planet." Despite these challenges, Whitfield approached his newfound freedom with remarkable grace. He established a foundation to assist wrongfully convicted individuals transitioning back to society. The Whitfield Second Chance Initiative provided housing assistance, technology training, and psychological support to exonerees struggling to rebuild their lives. "I was lucky," he explained during a fundraising event. "I had financial compensation and media attention. Many exonerees walk out of prison with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a system that's already failed them once." For Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, the aftermath of the Peters case brought a reckoning. Though cleared of any deliberate wrongdoing in the original investigation, he could not shake the knowledge that his trust in a fellow officer had contributed to an innocent man's conviction. After 4 decades with the Baltimore Police Department, he submitted his retirement papers in October 2020. His retirement ceremony was subdued, held in the same precinct where he had begun his career in 1979. Among the attendees was Michael Whitfield, whose presence caused a stir among officers unfamiliar with the unlikely friendship that had developed between the wrongfully convicted man and the detective who had helped put him away. When called upon to speak, Reeves kept his remarks brief. "Police work is about seeking truth," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not just closing cases, not just making arrests, but finding the actual truth. Sometimes that truth is inconvenient. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes it forces us to confront our own mistakes. But without truth, there can be no justice. And without justice, that badge we wear means nothing." As Reeves stepped down from the podium, Whitfield approached him, extending his hand. The room fell silent as the two men, both victims of the same deception, though in vastly different ways, shook hands. It was a moment of reconciliation that few had thought possible. "I blamed you for years," Whitfield acknowledged later, as they shared coffee in the station's break room. "Every appeal, every petition, I think about the detectives who built the case against me. But now I understand you were lied to as much as anyone." Reeves nodded slowly. "Doesn't excuse it, though. I should have seen through it. There were inconsistencies I ignored, because Peters was a brother in blue." "We all missed it," Whitfield replied. "Even my own lawyers didn't catch what you eventually did. You could have let it lie, you know. Could have stayed retired without reopening the case." "No," Reeves said firmly. "No, I couldn't have." That conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely partnership. In retirement, Reeves joined the Whitfield Second Chance Initiative as a consultant, lending his investigative expertise to reviews of other potential wrongful convictions. Together, they traveled to police academies across the country, sharing their story as a cautionary tale about tunnel vision, blind trust, and the devastating consequences when the justice system fails. Their presentation always concluded with Whitfield addressing the cadets directly. "You're entering a profession with enormous power, the power to take away someone's freedom, someone's future. Use that power carefully. Question everything, even when it comes from those you trust. Because when you get it wrong, lives are destroyed." While Whitfield and Reeves worked to prevent future wrongful convictions, Thomas Collins focused on preserving his daughter's legacy. The Memorial Garden at Johns Hopkins had become a place of reflection for nursing students, who often left small tokens, stethoscopes, pins, handwritten notes at the base of Sarah's statue. In April 2021, on what would have been Sarah's 57th birthday, Thomas Collins announced the establishment of the Sarah Lynn Collins Center for Nursing Ethics at Johns Hopkins, funded by a portion of his share of the settlement from Whitfield's wrongful conviction lawsuit. The center would focus on ethical practices in healthcare, with a particular emphasis on advocating for vulnerable patients. "My daughter wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves," the 81-year-old Collins explained at the dedication ceremony. "This center will continue that work in her name." The ceremony was attended by several of Sarah's former classmates, now senior healthcare professionals themselves. Many shared stories of the bright young woman they had known briefly, but remembered vividly. "Sarah always stood up for her patients," recalled Dr. Jennifer Morris, who had been Sarah's roommate before Melissa Parker. "Even as a student, she would question doctors if she thought something wasn't right." That kind of ethical courage is exactly what this center aims to instill in future nurses. As Baltimore approached the 35th anniversary of Sarah's murder in February 2021, local media began producing retrospectives on the case. Documentary filmmakers contacted Whitfield, Reeves, and Thomas Collins for interviews. National news outlets ran features on the remarkable developments and unlikely alliances that had emerged from the tragedy. For Baltimore itself, the Peters case had become a catalyst for change. The newly appointed police commissioner, Angela Williams, the first woman and second African-American to hold the position, made transparency and accountability cornerstones of her administration. She established an independent review board to examine evidence handling in major cases and implemented body camera requirements long before they became standard nationwide. "What happened to Michael Whitfield cannot happen again," Commissioner Williams declared during her swearing-in ceremony. Not in Baltimore, not anywhere. The changes extended beyond police procedures to the broader criminal justice system. The Maryland State Legislature passed the Whitfield-Collins Act in March 2021, establishing more rigorous standards for evidence preservation, expanding access to post-conviction DNA testing, and increasing compensation for wrongfully convicted individuals. The bill signing ceremony held in Annapolis brought together an unlikely coalition. Legislators from both parties, police representatives, criminal justice reform advocates, and the families most affected by the case, including Thomas Collins and Michael Whitfield, stood together as Governor Robert Mitchell signed the bill into law. This legislation won't undo the damage done to Mr. Whitfield or bring back Sarah Collins, the governor acknowledged, but it will help ensure that no other families have to endure what they have. As summer turned to fall in 2021, a new development in the case emerged. Lawrence Peters, serving his life sentence at the Maryland Correctional Institution in Hagerstown, requested a meeting with Marcus Reeves. After consultation with prosecutors and prison officials, the meeting was arranged for October 15th. Reeves arrived at the prison on a crisp autumn morning, the trees surrounding the facility ablaze with red and gold. He had visited countless inmates during his career, but had never expected to be visiting a former colleague, a man who had once worn the same badge, taken the same oath. Peters had aged dramatically in the 2 years since his arrest. His silver hair had turned completely white, his once robust frame now gaunt. He sat across from Reeves, in the visitation room, separated by a scratched plexiglass barrier, his hands resting on the metal counter. "Thank you for coming," Peters began, his voice raspy from disuse. Reeves merely nodded, waiting. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for months," Peters continued. "Nothing seems adequate. Sorry doesn't begin to cover it." "Then don't say it," Reeves replied evenly. "Why did you ask me here?" Peters sighed heavily. "Because there's something you should know. Something I never admitted, even after my confession." Reeves leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. "Sarah wasn't the first," Peters said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Reeves felt a chill run through him, despite the overheated room. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady. "2 others. Before Sarah. One in 1983, another in 1985. Both made to look like accidents or random violence. I was careful. No one ever connected them." Reeves fought to maintain his professional demeanor, though inside, rage and horror competed for dominance. 3 young women, not one. 3 lives ended by a predator hiding behind a badge. And he, like everyone else, had never seen it. "Names," he demanded. "Locations, dates, everything you remember." Peters nodded, producing a manila envelope, which he slid through the narrow slot beneath the partition. "It's all in there," as much as I could recall. Reeves took the envelope but didn't open it. "Why now?" Peters was quiet for a long moment. "I'm dying," he finally said. "Cancer, 6 months, maybe less. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But those families, they deserve to know what happened to their daughters." Reeves studied the man before him, searching for any sign of manipulation or deception. He saw only resignation and perhaps the faintest glimmer of what might have been remorse. "I'll look into it," Reeves said at last, rising to leave. "Not for you. For them." Peters nodded, understanding the distinction. As Reeves turned to go, Peters spoke again. "Marcus, I want you to know, I would have gotten away with all of it if you hadn't kept looking. You did what no one else could do. You found the truth." Reeves paused but didn't turn back. "That's the job," he said simply, and walked away, the envelope containing the details of 2 more lives destroyed, clutched tightly in his hand. The revelation of additional victims sent Reeves back to work, though unofficially. Working with a small team from the cold case unit, he verified Peters' claims and identified the 2 women. Diane Reynolds, 24, a legal secretary found dead in her car in 1983, her death attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning. And Catherine Winters, 19, a community college student whose body was discovered in Druid Hill Park in 1985, apparently the victim of a random assault. In both cases, Peters had responded to the scenes, collected evidence, and helped shape the narrative that led investigators away from him. Both cases had gone cold, the families left without answers for decades. The process of notifying those families fell to Reeves. He visited the Reynolds family first, driving to their home in Dundalk on a rainy November afternoon. Richard and Margaret Reynolds, now in their 80s, listened in stunned silence as Reeves explained what had happened to their daughter 38 years earlier. "You're saying a police officer killed our Diane?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "The same one who killed that nursing student." "Yes, ma'am," Reeves confirmed gently. "I know this comes as a shock after all these years." Richard Reynolds, who had been silent until then, suddenly slammed his fist on the coffee table. "We knew it wasn't an accident. We told the police Diane would never have stayed in that garage with the car running. She knew better, but they insisted it was accidental. Maybe she'd fallen asleep, they said. And all this time it was one of them who did it." The visit to the Winters family was equally heartbreaking. Catherine's parents had passed away, but her sister, Andrea, still lived in Baltimore. When Reeves told her about Peters, she collapsed into tears. "For 36 years, I've been looking over my shoulder, wondering if the person who killed Katie was walking the same streets as me," she sobbed. And he was. He was supposed to be protecting us. The identification of 2 additional victims transformed the Peters case from a singular tragedy to a pattern of predation spanning years. It raised troubling questions about oversight within the department and the ease with which Peters had been able to use his position to both commit and conceal his crimes. In January 2022, the Baltimore Sun published a comprehensive investigation titled Badge of Betrayal, The Lawrence Peters Story. The 7-part series examined not only Peters' crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to go undetected for so long. The series prompted a public apology from the Baltimore Police Department. In a press conference held at headquarters, Commissioner Williams addressed the families of all 3 victims directly. "The Baltimore Police Department failed you in the most fundamental way possible," she acknowledged, her voice steady but emotional. "An officer sworn to protect instead became a predator, and our systems were inadequate to detect or stop him. For that, we offer our deepest apology. It is insufficient, but it is sincere." The commissioner then announced a series of additional reforms, including psychological evaluations for officers every 5 years, expanded internal affairs staffing, and a cold case review unit specifically tasked with examining cases where responding officers later came under scrutiny for any reason. For the families of Diane Reynolds and Catherine Winters, the belated justice brought mixed emotions. Relief at finally knowing the truth competed with renewed grief and anger over the decades of unnecessary suffering. "I spent 36 years wondering, theorizing, suspecting random men I passed on the street," Andrea Winters told reporters. "All while my sister's killer was wearing a uniform, being paid by our tax dollars. How do you reconcile that?" There was no easy answer to her question, no way to undo the damage caused by one man's evil and an imperfect system's failure to detect it. But in the aftermath of these revelations, there emerged a renewed commitment to ensuring such failures would not be repeated. In February 2022, as Baltimore marked the 36th anniversary of Sarah Collins' murder, a unique memorial service was held at the Inner Harbor. For the first time, the families of all 3 victims, Collins, Reynolds, and Winters, gathered together, united by a shared tragedy. Thomas Collins, now using a wheelchair but still sharp at 82, addressed the gathering, his voice thin but resolute. "Today we remember not 1 but 3 beautiful young women whose lives were cut short by the same hand," he said. "Sarah, Diane, and Catherine never knew each other in life, but they are forever connected now. Their deaths exposed corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden. Because of them, changes are being made that will protect others. That is their legacy. The service concluded with the dedication of a new memorial, a simple stone bench overlooking the harbor, inscribed with the names of all three women and the words, "In memory of lives taken too soon. May the truth they revealed protect others." As the crowd dispersed, Michael Whitfield approached Thomas Collins, gently placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. "Are you doing all right with all this?" he asked quietly. Collins looked up at the man who had spent 33 years in prison for his daughter's murder. "You know, Michael, for decades, I thought justice had been served. I thought I knew who took my Sarah, finding out I was wrong, that the real killer was still free, that broke something in me all over again." He paused, gazing out over the harbor where his daughter's body had been found so many years ago. "But then I think about you. 33 years of your life gone because of the same lie I believed. And I realize the truth matters. No matter how painful, the truth matters." Whitfield nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind the simple statement. "It does, and the truth is finally being told." As the sun began to set over the harbor, casting long shadows across the water, Marcus Reeves joined them. The three men, each affected in profoundly different ways by the same tragedy, stood together in silence, watching as the city lights began to flicker on around them. "Baltimore calls itself Charm City," Reeves said finally. "Always struck me as ironic, given what we see in this job. But maybe the real charm isn't in harbor views or crab cakes. Maybe it's in how a city faces its mistakes, learns from them, tries to do better." Thomas Collins nodded slowly. "Sarah would have liked that idea. She always believed in second chances, in learning from mistakes." "So do I," Whitfield said quietly. "Had to survive." As darkness fell completely, the three unlikely allies made their way from the harbor, leaving behind the bench that now stood as a monument not only to three lost lives, but to a city's painful reckoning with its past and its commitment to a more just future. Lawrence Peters died in prison in March 2022, taking to his grave whatever remaining secrets he might have held. His passing was noted briefly in the press, but otherwise unremarked upon. For the families of his victims, his death brought neither closure nor satisfaction, merely the end of a chapter in a story that had already cost them too much. The wider impact of the case, however, continued to unfold. The Whitfield-Collins Act became a model for similar legislation in neighboring states. The Sarah Lynn Collins Center for Nursing Ethics established itself as a leading voice in healthcare advocacy. The Whitfield Second Chance Initiative expanded to serve exonerees across the mid-Atlantic region. In police academies throughout Maryland, cadets now studied the Peters case as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of corruption and the vital importance of ethical policing. The message was clear and uncompromising. The badge was not a shield from scrutiny, but a symbol of greater responsibility. For Baltimore itself, the case represented both a painful wound and a catalyst for healing. The city that had once prided itself on its charm now embraced a different kind of pride. Pride in confronting its failures honestly, in refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, in committing to the difficult work of reform. On a warm spring day in May 2022, Marcus Reeves returned to the Johns Hopkins campus to speak at the nursing school's graduation ceremony. As he approached the podium, he passed the bronze statue of Sarah Collins, its outstretched hands seeming to offer both comfort and challenge. Looking out over the sea of fresh young faces in their caps and gowns, Reeves was struck by how similar they looked to Sarah in the photograph he had carried for so many years. They were the same age she had been, filled with the same hopes and dreams, embarking on the same path of service. "Your profession and mine are not so different," he began. "We both see people at their worst and most vulnerable moments. We both have the power to help or to harm. And we both bear the awesome responsibility of holding lives in our hands." He paused, glancing back at Sarah's statue. 36 years ago, a young woman who should be standing where I am today perhaps as one of your instructors or administrators, had her life and dreams stolen from her. Her case taught me the most important lesson of my career, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that the truth has a power that transcends time, and that our obligation to seek that truth never expires. As Reeves concluded his remarks, the graduating class rose in a spontaneous, standing ovation. Among them, wearing a white coat instead of a cap and gown, stood Andrea Winters, Catherine's sister, who had been inspired by her decades-long search for her sister's killer to become a forensic nurse specializing in evidence collection. My sister's case went unsolved for 36 years because evidence was mishandled by the very person who should have been protecting it. She had explained when interviewed about her career choice. I want to make sure that never happens to another family. In the audience sat Thomas Collins, Michael Whitfield, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the case. They watched as the new generation of healthcare professionals took their oath, promising to serve with integrity and compassion. As the ceremony concluded, Reeves made his way to where Thomas Collins waited in his wheelchair. "Good speech," the elderly man said, extending a gnarled hand. "Sarah would have liked it." Reeves took the offered hand, noting how frail it felt in his grasp. "I hope so. I've tried to do right by her memory." "You have," Collins assured him. "You found the truth when everyone else had stopped looking." "Can't ask for more than that." As they made their way slowly from the auditorium, they passed a wall of photographs, distinguished alumni and faculty who had shaped the nursing school's history. Among them, newly added, was a photograph of Sarah Lynn Collins, her bright smile frozen in time beneath the words, "In memory of what was lost and in celebration of what endures." For Baltimore, for the families, for Reeves and Whitfield, the journey had been long and painful. Justice had come late, too late for 3 young women whose lives were cut short, too late for an innocent man who lost decades behind bars, too late for families who spent years believing lies. But it had come, and in its coming, it had transformed a city, inspired reforms, created unlikely alliances, and demonstrated that even the darkest secrets could not remain hidden forever. As the spring sun set over Baltimore, casting a golden glow across the harbor and the city beyond, the lesson of the Peters case echoed through courtrooms, police stations, and hospitals, that charm was no substitute for truth, that no badge could forever shield corruption, and that justice, though it might travel a long and winding road, would find its way home in the end. As the years passed, the Peters case and its aftermath continued to ripple through Baltimore. What had begun as a single murder investigation had evolved into a catalyst for systemic change, not only in policing, but in how the city viewed itself and its institutions. The story of Sarah Collins, Michael Whitfield, and Lawrence Peters became part of Baltimore's collective consciousness, a painful chapter in its history, but also a testament to the enduring power of truth and perseverance. By 2025, Thomas Collins had moved into an assisted living facility in Towson, his health declining, but his mind still sharp. His room was filled with photographs, Sarah in her high school graduation gown, Sarah in her nursing uniform, and newer additions, the dedication of the Ethics Center bearing her name, the memorial bench at the Inner Harbor, himself alongside Michael Whitfield and Marcus Reeves at various events over the years. Visitors often remarked on the unlikely friendship that had developed between Collins and Whitfield. How could a father bear to befriend the man once convicted of his daughter's murder? Collins always gave the same answer. We were both victims of the same lie, and finding the truth together gave us both some measure of peace. On a crisp October morning in 2025, Whitfield visited Collins at the facility, bringing a small potted orchid, Sarah's favorite flower he had learned over their years of acquaintance. He found the elderly man sitting by the window, gazing out at the autumn leaves swirling in the courtyard below. "Good day, Thomas," Whitfield greeted him, placing the plant on the windowsill. "Thought you might like some color in here." Collins smiled, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the delicate petals. Beautiful! Sarah always loved orchids. Said they reminded her that beautiful things can grow in the most unlikely places. They sat together in companionable silence for a few minutes before Collins spoke again. They're making a documentary, you know. About the case. About all of us. They want to interview me next week. Whitfield nodded. They contacted me too. Not sure how I feel about it, to be honest. Will you do it? Probably. If it helps even one person understand how these things happen, how they can be prevented. Seems worth it. Collins turned from the window to face Whitfield directly. They asked me something interesting, what I would say to Peters if he were still alive. I've been thinking about it ever since. And? Whitfield prompted gently when Collins fell silent. The older man's eyes grew distant. I'd ask him why. Not just why Sarah, but why any of them. What darkness lives inside a person that makes them take a life? Especially someone who swore to protect lives. He shook his head slowly. I've had 40 years to think about it and I still don't understand. I don't think we're meant to understand evil, Whitfield replied. Just recognize it and stop it when we can. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Reeves. Now 73, but still standing straight, his silver hair closely cropped. Though fully retired, he remained active in police reform initiatives and regularly spoke at law enforcement training programs across the country. Hope I'm not interrupting, Reeves said, nodding to both men. Not at all, Collins assured him. We were just discussing the documentary. Ah, yes, they've been quite persistent. Reeves settled into an empty chair. I told them I'd participate on one condition, that they focus not just on what went wrong, but on what's been fixed because of it. The documentary, titled Charm City's Reckoning, would premiere at the Maryland Film Festival in May 2026, 40 years after Sarah's murder. It traced the entire arc of the case, from the initial disappearance through the wrongful conviction, the decades of imprisonment, the eventual discovery of the truth, and the reforms that followed. The filmmakers had assembled an impressive array of interviews, not only Collins, Whitfield, and Reeves, but also former prosecutors, defense attorneys, forensic experts, and current police leadership. They had access to original case files, crime scene photos, and court transcripts. Most powerfully, they included testimony from the families of Diane Reynolds and Catherine Winters, whose cases might never have been solved if not for Peter's deathbed confession. On the night of the premiere, Baltimore's historic Charles Theatre was filled to capacity. Thomas Collins attended in his wheelchair, accompanied by a nurse from his facility. Michael Whitfield sat beside him, both men looking somewhat uncomfortable in the formal attire required for the occasion. Marcus Reeves arrived with his daughter and grandchildren, who had grown up hearing pieces of the story that had defined the latter part of his career. Also present were Andrea Winters, now the head of Maryland's Sexual Assault Forensic Examiner Program, and Richard Reynolds, Jr., who had followed in his sister Diane's footsteps by becoming a legal advocate for wrongfully convicted individuals. As the lights dimmed and the film began, the audience fell silent. For the next 2 hours, they watched as the complex, tragic story unfolded on screen. There were audible gasps when Peter's confession was played, tears when the families spoke of their loved ones, and a spontaneous burst of applause when footage showed Governor Mitchell signing the Whitfield-Collins Act into law. The documentary did not shy away from difficult questions. It examined the culture within the Baltimore Police Department that had allowed Peters to operate undetected for years. It confronted the racial and socio-economic factors that had made Whitfield a convenient scapegoat. It questioned why it had taken decades for the truth to emerge when the evidence had been there all along, waiting for someone to look at it with fresh eyes. But it also celebrated the resilience of those who had refused to give up. Thomas Collins, who had kept his daughter's memory alive. Michael Whitfield, who had maintained his innocence through 33 years of imprisonment. Marcus Reeves, who had reopened a cold case against all expectations. And the many others who had contributed to the eventual discovery of the truth. When the credits rolled, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Many were openly weeping. The filmmakers invited Collins, Whitfield, and Reeves to the stage for a brief discussion. "Mr. Collins," the director asked, 40 years after losing your daughter, what do you hope people take away from this film?" Collins leaned toward the microphone, his voice thin but clear. "That justice isn't just about punishment. It's about truth. Even when that truth is painful, even when it forces us to question what we thought we knew, we must pursue it. Because without truth there can be no real justice." The film went on to win numerous awards and was eventually broadcast nationally, bringing the story of Sarah Collins, Michael Whitfield, and the Baltimore Police Department's darkest chapter to audiences across the country. It sparked discussions about police reform, wrongful convictions, and the use of forensic genealogy in cold cases. But perhaps its most significant impact was felt in Baltimore itself, where it became required viewing for police cadets, law students, and nursing students alike. The lessons of the Peters case, about accountability, about vigilance, about the corrupting potential of power, were woven into the training of a new generation of professionals. In November 2026, Baltimore elected a new mayor, Andrea Winters, whose platform centered on criminal justice reform, transparency in government, and victim advocacy. Her campaign had drawn national attention, not only because of her personal connection to the Peters case, but because of her unique perspective as both a victim's family member and a forensic professional. At her inauguration, standing on the steps of City Hall, Mayor Winters acknowledged the complex legacy she was inheriting. "Baltimore has long called itself Charm City," she said, echoing words Marcus Reeves had spoken years earlier. But true charm isn't about appearance. It's about character. It's about facing hard truths and becoming better because of them. It's about ensuring that the systems we build to protect us do not become weapons turned against us. She paused, scanning the crowd where Thomas Collins, Michael Whitfield, and Marcus Reeves sat in the front row. "The story that brought me to this podium today is one of both profound failure and remarkable redemption. It reminds us that institutions are only as good as the people within them, and that the pursuit of justice must never be subordinated to convenience or comfort or the protection of power." Tea. Her words resonated beyond Baltimore, as cities across the country grappled with similar issues of police accountability, evidence handling, and wrongful convictions. The Whitfield-Collins Act had by then been adopted in some form by 27 states, each implementing its own versions of the reforms pioneered in Maryland. The Sarah Lynn Collins Center for Nursing Ethics had expanded its mission to include training for law enforcement officers and healthcare providers on recognizing and reporting signs of abuse. Its collaborative approach brought together professionals from fields that had historically operated in silos, creating a more integrated approach to protecting vulnerable individuals. Michael Whitfield's Second Chance Initiative had grown into a national organization with chapters in 15 states, providing comprehensive support to exonerees transitioning back into society. Its advocacy had led to improved compensation laws and automatic expungement of records for those proven innocent through DNA or other conclusive evidence. For Marcus Reeves, these developments represented the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself when he first reopened the Collins case. That something good would come from the tragedy, that the truth, however belated, would serve some greater purpose. In spring 2027, Reeves received an invitation from Johns Hopkins University to deliver the commencement address for the nursing school's graduating class. The invitation noted that this would be the final class to graduate before the opening of the new Sarah Lynn Collins Memorial Building, which would house expanded facilities for the Ethics Center and a museum documenting the case and its impact on healthcare, law enforcement, and criminal justice. As Reeves prepared his remarks, he found himself reflecting on the long, winding path that had led from a cold February night in 1986 to the present day. So much had changed. Baltimore's skyline, its leadership, its approach to policing. DNA technology that had been in its infancy when Sarah was murdered was now sophisticated enough to identify a perpetrator from microscopic samples decades old. Body cameras, civilian review boards, and independent forensic oversight, all now standard, had been unimaginable in the 1980s. Yet amid all this change, certain constants remained. The need for vigilance against abuse of power, the importance of questioning convenient narratives, the obligation to seek truth however uncomfortable. These were the lessons of the Collins case, lessons that transcended time and technology. On the day of the commencement, Reeves stood at the podium looking out over a sea of fresh young faces in their caps and gowns. In the front row sat Thomas Collins, now 87, frail but determined to attend this milestone event. Beside him was Michael Whitfield, who had become like a son to the elderly man in the years since his exoneration. 41 years ago, Reeves began, a young woman named Sarah Collins was preparing to graduate from this very institution. Like you, she had spent years studying, practicing, preparing to enter a profession dedicated to healing and care. She never had the chance to fulfill that promise. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. But in a way, I don't think anyone could have foreseen. Sarah has had perhaps a greater impact on health care, on law enforcement, on our justice system, than she might have had in a single lifetime of practice. Her story, our collective failure and our belated attempt to make it right, has transformed how we think about evidence, about accountability, about the systems we build to protect us. Reeves gestured toward Collins and Whitfield. These two men, one who lost a daughter, one who lost 33 years of his life, could have emerged from this tragedy bitter and broken. Instead, they chose to channel their pain into purpose, to create meaning from senseless loss. Their example reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have choices about how we respond, about what we build from the ruins. As he concluded his address, Reeves shared a final thought. The true measure of justice is not how swiftly we punish, but how honestly we reckon with our mistakes, how humbly we learn from them, and how determinedly we work to ensure they are not repeated. That is the legacy of Sarah Collins. That is the challenge I leave with each of you today. The applause that followed was thunderous, the standing ovation lasting several minutes. As Reeves made his way back to his seat, he passed Thomas Collins, who reached out to clasp his hand. "Thank you," the elderly man said simply. Sarah would have been proud. Later that afternoon, Reeves, Collins and Whitfield visited the construction site of the new Sarah Lynn Collins Memorial Building. Though still months from completion, its basic structure was in place, a modern glass and steel design that would stand in stark contrast to the traditional brick buildings surrounding it. The project manager led them through what would eventually become the museum space, where exhibits would detail the case, the investigation, the wrongful conviction, and the eventual discovery of the truth. One wall would be dedicated to the three victims, Sarah Collins, Diane Reynolds, and Catherine Winters, celebrating their lives rather than merely documenting their deaths. Another section would examine the systemic failures that had allowed Peters to operate undetected, and the reforms that had followed. Interactive displays would educate visitors about forensic evidence, DNA technology, and the evolving standards for police accountability. As they toured the space, Thomas Collins moved slowly, leaning heavily on his walker. At one point he paused, visibly fatigued, and Whitfield gently suggested they take a break. "I'm fine," Collins insisted. "I want to see it all. May not get another chance." The poignancy of those words was not lost on his companions. At 87, with declining health, Collins was increasingly aware of his own mortality. His greatest fear, he had once confided to Reeves, was that he would not live to see the building completed, that final tangible testament to his daughter's legacy. Sensing this urgency, the project manager led them to a special feature at the center of the museum, a bronze statue of Sarah, similar to the one in the Memorial Garden but larger, more detailed. This version showed her in her nursing uniform, one hand extended in a gesture of healing, the other holding a book representing knowledge and ethics. At the base of the statue was a simple inscription: Sarah Lynn Collins, 1964-1986. In her memory we seek truth. In her honor we pursue justice. Collins stood before the statue for a long moment, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached out to touch the bronze fingers of his daughter's likeness. "It's perfect," he whispered. "Just perfect." 3 months later, Thomas Collins passed away peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was attended by hundreds, family, friends, former colleagues of Sarah's, nursing students who had benefited from the Ethics Center, police officers trained under reforms bearing his name, and countless others whose lives had been touched by his unwavering pursuit of truth and justice. Michael Whitfield delivered the eulogy, speaking with quiet dignity of the man who had, against all odds, become his closest friend. "Thomas Collins could have lived out his life in bitter anger," Whitfield said. "He had every right to. The system failed his daughter. It failed him. It failed me. But Thomas chose a different path. He chose to transform his pain into purpose, his grief into action. He taught me that justice isn't about vengeance, but about truth, even when that truth hurts, even when it forces us to question everything we thought we knew." Marcus Reeves sat in the front pew, listening as Whitfield continued. Thomas never got to see his daughter fulfill her promise as a nurse, but he lived long enough to see her legacy transform an entire city, to inspire reforms that will protect countless others. In the end, I think that gave him some measure of peace. Following Collins' wishes, he was laid to rest beside Sarah and Elaine in a small cemetery overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. His headstone bore a simple epitaph: "Seeker of truth, champion of justice, beloved father." As the mourners dispersed, Reeves and Whitfield lingered at the graveside, two men in their 70s, bound by a shared history neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed decades earlier. "I keep thinking about something Thomas said to me once," Whitfield mused. "He said that losing Sarah was like having his heart torn out, but that finding the truth, even after all those years, was like getting a small piece of it back. Not enough to make him whole again, but enough to help him breathe." Reeves nodded, understanding. Truth matters. Even when it comes too late, even when it can't undo the damage. It still matters. They stood in silence for a moment longer, paying their final respects to a man whose quiet dignity and persistent search for answers had helped transform Baltimore's approach to justice. As they turned to leave, Whitfield paused, looking back at the 3 gravestones, Sarah, Elaine, and now Thomas. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in a strange way we all got what we needed in the end. Not what we wanted. God knows none of us would have chosen this path, but what we needed. Thomas needed the truth about his daughter. I needed my freedom and my name cleared. You needed to set right what went wrong on your watch." Reeves considered this. "And Baltimore? What did the city need?" "A reckoning," Whitfield replied without hesitation. "A hard look in the mirror, a chance to acknowledge its failures and commit to doing better." 6 months later, in May 2028, the Sarah Lynn Collins Memorial Building was officially dedicated. The ceremony drew dignitaries from across the state and beyond: Governor Mitchell, Mayor Winters, university officials, and representatives from law enforcement, healthcare, and criminal justice reform organizations. Michael Whitfield and Marcus Reeves sat side by side in the front row, both acutely aware of the empty chair where Thomas Collins should have been. Yet in a very real sense, his presence permeated the event, his vision made manifest in steel and glass, in exhibits and programs designed to ensure that the lessons of his daughter's case would never be forgotten. After the ribbon cutting, visitors streamed through the new building, experiencing for the first time the powerful narrative it presented. They moved from exhibits documenting Sarah's life and dreams to displays explaining the investigation, the wrongful conviction, and the eventual discovery of the truth. They listened to audio recordings of Thomas Collins, Michael Whitfield, and Marcus Reeves, sharing their perspectives on the case that had bound their lives together. Perhaps most impactful was the final exhibit, a mirrored room where visitors confronted their own reflections while listening to a recorded message. The story you have witnessed here is not simply a historical account. It is an ongoing challenge to question authority, to demand accountability, to seek truth even when it is uncomfortable. As you leave this place, ask yourself, what systems do I participate in? What assumptions do I accept without question? What truth am I responsible for seeking? For Baltimore, the opening of the memorial building represented a milestone in its journey from tragedy to transformation. The city that had once prided itself on superficial charm had embraced a deeper, more authentic identity, one that acknowledged past failures while committing to a more just future. As twilight fell on dedication day, Whitfield and Reeves stood outside the building, watching as its glass facade reflected the changing colors of the evening sky. "Thomas would have loved this," Whitfield said softly. Reeves nodded. He saw it in his mind. That was enough. They turned to leave just as the building's lights came on, illuminating the statue of Sarah Collins at its center. From outside, her bronze figure seemed to glow with an inner light, her outstretched hand a perpetual offering of healing and hope. For a city once known as Charm City, the true charm had finally been found, not in harbor views or historic neighborhoods, but in the courage to face hard truths, to learn from painful mistakes, and to ensure that justice, however delayed, would not be eternally denied. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.